stand up, don't give up the fight.
All right, everyone, welcome. We're going to get started on Building Capacity for Disruption, the fourth event in our Radical Reimaginations for Climate Justice series. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Ana Isabel Baptista. I'm an assistant professor here at the New School and also an associate director at the Tishman Environment and Design Center. Before joining the New School, I worked for about a decade in Newark, New Jersey at the Ironbound Community Corporation where Miya is working now. And my research and practice is really centered on continuing this work, collaborating with EJ orgs on the development of climate and EJ policies. And I also work on land use and planning tools and zero waste and cumulative impacts policies as well. So I'm very excited to host our guests today. Before we get started on our conversation, I wanted to just give a little bit of context as to why we're holding these discussions. About 2 years ago, the Northlight Foundation approached the Tishman Center and my colleague Sujatha at the Social Movements Innovation Lab here about potentially investing in a leadership program targeting the EJ movement. And we began by exploring this by conducting a landscape assessment, asking EJ movement leaders across the country what their needs and priorities were. And we learned a lot about a potential direction for the program that would take on maybe continuing the work on climate justice. We also borrowed a lot of insights from social movement literature, suggesting that one of the key elements for successful social movements is the need for contentious tactics and strategies that really disrupt the status quo. So we decided to center the program's design on contentious strategies and really look at the ways that we can catalyze more rapid change for climate justice. So we know going into this that there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge and questions that we have about the frameworks or social movement theories that we could tap into. So we decided to create a space for thought leaders and movement leaders to be in conversation with one another and with us about how we might work on this fellowship program. So today's conversation specifically is going to be talking about sort of the risky, contentious strategies in the EJ movement that help advance the movement's climate justice vision. And I'm going to start by introducing a little bit of a brief rundown of today's format and then the speakers themselves. So I think Maru is going to put up a little slide here. So for those of you joining us today, we're going to break up our conversation today into 3 parts. The first one will be a lightly moderated conversation with our guests, Hahrie, Maria Lopez-Nuñez, and Miya Yoshitani. We'll have a short 5-minute break at 2 o'clock. And then we'll have a chance to go into breakout rooms where we'll have a deeper conversation about the conversation in the first hour. And then we'll come back together again in the last 20 minutes for a short Q&A and share some final insights. So that's sort of the overview of how we're going to organize the next 2 hours together. And now I think I'm just going to jump into introducing briefly our speakers. We have with us today Dr. Hahrie, who's a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. Hahrie is the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute and a faculty director of the P3 Research Lab there. This lab is dedicated to understanding how to make the participation of ordinary people possible, probable, powerful, with a particular focus on collective action, organizing, and movement building. Hahrie specializes in the study of civic and political participation, social movements, collective action, and organizing, particularly as it pertains to democratic revitalization. Her newest book is going to be coming out soon, entitled Prisms of the People, Power, and Organizing in 21st Century America, that examines the way grassroots organizations translate engagement of their people into political power. She has numerous publications on the role that organizational context and habits of courage and risk-taking can play in building the power of movements. And she's putting this research to good work, doing various efforts, including the co-founding of the Center for Democracy and Organizing. So we're looking forward to learning a lot about her work in our discussion today. We also are very lucky to have with us Miya Yoshitani, who is the executive director of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network since 2013. And she started at APEN as a youth organizer in the 90s and has an extensive background in community organizing in EJ. APIN has been fighting and winning EJ struggles for the past 27 years and is one of the most unique organizations in the country, developing the leadership and power of poor and working class Asian American immigrants and refugee communities. Miya has supported APIN's growth and expansion from a powerful local organization in the Bay Area to having a statewide impact through integrated voter engagement strategy, which is one of the largest in the country. And APIN really reflects the grassroots sort of intersectional nature of the EJ movement working on issues from occupational safety of tech workers to affordable housing to challenging multinational corporations who are harming the health and well-being of low-income and communities of color. And Miya has a long and rich legacy in the EJ movement. She was actually one of the participants in the first National People of Color Summit in 1991 and is now involved in many key networks like CJA. So she has a wealth of institutional knowledge and legacy to draw on that will surely animate our conversation today. And last but not least, we have Maria Lopez-Nuñez, who's the Deputy Director of Organizing and Advocacy for Ironbound Community Corporation in Newark. Yay, Newark. We're going to give a big effort to Newark today. ICC has a rich legacy of over 40 years of grassroots activism, organizing residents in Newark, and also working with communities facing similar struggles across the country. Maria has over 10 years of experience as a facilitator. She specializes in conflict resolution, racial and gender justice, and community building. She's a founding member of the Roots Project, Inc., an organization that leads trainings in social justice, building connections, and healing communities. Her leadership at home and nationally in the movement extends across a range of intersectional issues, including the passage of Newark's groundbreaking Civilian Complaint Review Board, a statewide eviction moratorium bill, and more recently, the equitable allocation of housing and COVID-19 relief funds. This month, Maria played a critical role in realizing a precedent-setting EJ bill in New Jersey that mandates the state deny permits on the basis of cumulative impacts in EJ communities. And it's really been a privilege to work alongside Maria on some of these efforts in Newark and witness up close and personal the fierceness and fearlessness that she brings to this work. So I know we're gonna have a not boring conversation today and really get into some real great conversations. So I'm going to jump right in and no soft opening questions. We're going to jump in and ask if you all can talk about and real talk on what it means to be risky and contentious in the movements that you're in and in the movements that you study. What does that look like to each of you when you think about the riskier or more contentious way that you're breaking from the status quo? What are the constraints you're trying to break from to advance a more radical agenda? So I wanted to see if, who wanted to kick off any thoughts on what it means to be risky or contentious. Don't all scramble at once. I'm gonna to tell us what you really think about contention. I don't know if Hahrie, do you want to start us off by telling us?
Sure, I can
start. The work you do?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me into this conversation. And I am really excited to have this opportunity to talk with Maria and Miya and all of you. So thank you for that. When I think about like what it means to be radical or contentious, there's obviously like lots of different ways to answer that question. But here's one thing that I'll offer to kick us off. And I'm excited to hear what Maria and Miya have to add to this, which is to take, what does it mean to take seriously the indivisibility of human dignity? And I think that that unfortunately feels more radical than it should be. And so the context within which I've been thinking about it, so this is the like 100th year anniversary of suffrage, and everyone's talking about how it's like so awesome, 100 years of women's suffrage and stuff like that. And I was reading a book recently by a colleague of mine, Martha Jones at Johns Hopkins, who wrote a book called Vanguard that's about the role of Black women throughout American history in leading the fight for change. And the point that she makes is that even as we celebrate suffrage, there is this deep contradiction in it, which is that it preached the language of equal rights, but it was equal rights that left out Black women, right? And that pattern that she describes is so prevalent throughout our history and so many of our movements for social change that we make change on behalf of some, but not all. And And so it struck me in reading that history about how radical it is to really think about dignity in our own, and the dignity of our constituents as being completely indivisible. So it's not that we can fight for just women or just Black people, but that we can fight, build movements that really fight for, intersectionally for, Black women or whoever it is that our constituencies are. And I think that one of the big struggles that I see in a lot of movements, the EJ movement included, is how do you do that? How do you build that kind of solidarity within the movement and then turn that solidarity into power? And from where I sit in the academy, I think one of the challenges that we have is how do we put a name to what it takes to turn solidarity into power, for example? I think a lot of times, academics have a way of decontextualizing the work of building solidarity from power, right? So that it becomes a challenge of coordination, of building social networks, of building social capital, of things like that. But then we remove that from what it means to actually, what does it mean to actually engage in a struggle for political rights, let's say, to use the example of suffrage, in a way that doesn't leave Black women out? What would have been necessary for the movement at that time to have been able to do that? And I think there's a lot that requires us to look both internally at how we construct our movements inside, but then also externally in terms of how we think about the relationship to the targets and so on. So anyway, so maybe I'll sort of start with that question of what does it mean to take seriously the indivisibility of the dignity of ourselves and our people, and is that radical or not, as a starting point for conversation.
Yeah, Miya, Maria, if you want to jump in, and any thoughts on what Hahrie presented, or your own thoughts about taking risks and contention seriously.
I feel like starting with taking risk or starting with disruption is like starting with the end of do the right thing, it like misses all the context. And I also want to just note that like when it comes to disruption, it's something I've heard on Shark Tank. So how radical can it actually be when folks on Shark Tank are like, ooh, you're disrupting the industry, and like how in our movement, I feel like there's this fetishization, right? Like this obsession of like, ooh, who are the disruptors? And that comes from like white assholes like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, and like that's not who we should be glorifying as a strategy, because it is a strategy. It's a tactic, I would say. It's not the whole strategy. It's not the means to an end. It's kind of the explosion that happens after like a lot of different things are happening. So for me, the conversation needs to go in we'll get back to disruption, but we could start with like, I think the work our movement's been doing for a long time, which says, I think folks on the outside, it looks slow, like slow progress, but because our work is so intersectional, I think it's, the moment is now catching up to us, right? Of saying that we can't just have like a fight for racial justice, that we need to include gender justice, that we can't just fight against the police. We need to look at all these other systems as well, and how we can kind of like have a systems lens approach when we do our work, which I obviously I'm biased, but I think our movement's done excellent, and I'm glad that people are catching up, so hopefully there's some lessons to be learned here.
Yeah, I just like jump off a couple of things. I think it is really important not to confuse disruption or radicalism like with just tactics. So like tactics that, like we need to use all the tools in our toolbox. So street protests or banner drops or civil disobedience or those kinds of things that I think are kind of, in some people's imagination, like that makes you radical because you're using a certain tactic. And I think to me, like what is most disruptive is actually the transformational imagination of systemic change that you have and that like is embedded in a community. And I think that the other thing that is, to me, one of the most disruptive aspects of the environmental justice movement is actually putting people who are the most impacted by that set of intersectional issues at the center of both like leadership and the solutions. And to me, that is what is disruptive and what has the disruptive potential of the EJ movement. And when I say EJ movement too, just like very careful not to, we were talking about this in, I think when we were talking earlier before when we were kind of preparing for this, that like, you know, we don't want the EJ movement, or I don't want the EJ movement to be seen as like an appendage of the environmental movement. When we're talking about EJ, we are really talking about an intersectional approach to systemic change. And that includes targeting where real power is and fighting and organizing in the front lines for real power. And to me, that's where you start when you want to talk about like what it means to be radical or disruptive, not starting at the tactics, and not saying that that's what you were offering, but just saying, you know, like I think that's when people start talking about what it means to be disruptive, like kind of as if disruption in of itself is the goal. Disruption is the goal of the disrupting the system, not tactical disruption. So how can we actually build the power that we need to truly dismantle the system that is causing the cumulative disempowerment of our communities? How do we do that? And I think that's the starting place of where the EJ movement kind of got its origins.
Yeah, and if I may, because I feel like, you know, and I was telling, I guess, our panelists, I feel like right now we've are in all these conversations about disrupting on the streets and take the streets back, but it kind of makes me feel like there's an expectation of more of being gladiators in Rome as opposed to taking down the empire. People don't really want to talk about taking down the empire. They want to see like the carnage and the blood from the gladiators.
Street fights.
Yeah, you know, street fights. It's like, yo, that's, I mean, you know, whatever needs to happen, and I'm for it, but let's not confuse what's happening in the stage with, you know, taking down the empire.
So maybe we can do some more of that context setting too, and talking about what does it take to bring down, like, you know, capitalism, patriarchy, settler colonialism, all these systems that, you know, the EJ movement is pushing against. What are you all thinking about in terms of the conditions that you need, right? What are the enabling conditions that allow people who are at the very front lines, who are already in positions of great risk, right, to be able to continue to push against those and transform those systems? Like, what do you think about our, you know, our necessary conditions to be able, you know, to enable people to take those steps, not just for the carnage, but for the long-term empire, taking down the empire, or rebuilding an empire, I guess?
Well, I mean, I think a starting place is actually really understanding our communities and seeing them as whole people, and that there is no, like, we're not trying to address, I guess this addresses like the intersectionality of issues, and that like when we're talking about a community that has been maybe like poisoned by a refinery or by toxic waste dump or something like that, those are also the same communities who are being targeted by ICE, who are being targeted by the criminal justice system, you know, who are being, you know, whose votes are being stolen, who don't have access to, you know, to proper, like, or like to a good education, to healthy food, to, you know, all these things. Is like there's a cumulative nature to the way that people are experiencing their daily lives. And I think for one part of the context is like, stop separating people from from their humanity and from who they really are. Stop trying to win like single issues by like pulling our communities and wedging them from each other, you know. So there has to be, and part of it is our movements need to have a clear vision that aligns at this intersectional moment, so that we're not throwing anyone under the bus when we're fighting for real liberation.
Yeah, in terms of organizing, I would say like there's a lot of academic terminology that is constantly being renewed and like refreshed. And that's not how I talk to my community, or nor how I want to be talked to, right? Like I don't see a separation there either. But I've learned that like movement spaces are just filled with terminology and like it feels like thousands of rules about how to be an activist. And that just doesn't make it accessible to folks, you know? So I was having a conversation with my partner about like the type of situation I want to be in. It's kind of like a mob boss, you know, like I think about New York and gangs of New York, you know, and like, how can we actually like turn blocks, right? Like, and think about systems that do exist in our community, like gangs and organizing. How do we go door to door and win block by block, so that then when we, you know, I think I was at a funder meeting, they asked me like, how do you measure success? And I was like, I measure success by seeing who's afraid of ICC, you know, like how do developers feel when they realize they have to deal in our turf? You know, how do polluters feel when they realize we are paying attention? Because, you know, obviously I've grown up my whole life kind of being afraid of the system, but resentful of the system. So how do we, like, I think that to me is disruptive, is making people in power afraid of an organized community that has built relationships to each other. Because I do really believe that one of the great successes of capitalism is separating us from our neighbors, right? Like separating our, like, interdependence of our humanity away and thinking that we're all, you know, we got to protect ourselves and our issues. While when we embrace all oppressed people's issues, like we really are, I think, fighting for each other. And then we're more likely to stick up for each other, right? Like I hung out with you at the barbecue and then your house is getting threatened. I'm gonna show up to City Hall for you, you know? And then when I get picked up by the police, hopefully you show up and you're protesting outside the precinct. And I think that really building those strong local bonds is what's gonna dismantle the system, not the approach that's been taken in, let's say, the environmental movement, which I agree with Miya completely is separate from ours, which is just looking at the environment as a separate thing, you know, like very sciencey, as if we don't exist and are a part of it, you know?
Hey everybody, this is Hahrie. I got kicked off and so I'm back on. Just want to let you know.
Thanks for joining us. You know, hopefully you get to hear a little bit of Miya and Maria talking a little bit about the enabling conditions for, you know, dismantling systems. And, you know, I know you've written a lot about the internal and external risks that organizers take when they do this kind of work. Maybe if you want to add anything else about, I think you call them habits of courage, like what it takes for organizers to organize in their communities, in their peers, you know, because there's a lot of risks you all take also within the movement as well as external with targets like the corporate actors or the state. So I don't know if Hahrie, you want to add anything else about what you've learned about those habits that organizers develop.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to go. I also, I just missed like 15 minutes of the conversation, so I don't know what
if you want to wait and
said
jump in
said.
a minute, yeah.
So yeah, whatever. I mean, whatever is helpful. So
yeah. I mean, one of the other things that I'm curious to hear from all of you is about there's this idea about what's the role of the nonprofits in organizing communities, what the challenges or maybe the, you know, the pros that come with having really well-established nonprofits and organizations to taking risks. So I don't know if either of you have any insights from being, you know, both of you are in nonprofits, some of you, you know, you've been there a long time. And if you have any thoughts about the tensions or opportunities of being able to advance, you know, your agendas and organize well in the communities using those organizational structures.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, just to state what hopefully is obvious is that nonprofits are not going to lead the revolution. You know, we're not going to be, nonprofits are not going to be on the, you know, the forefront of dismantling the system. That doesn't mean that they don't have a place and an important like part of the infrastructure that actually supports like radical transformational acts. And I think that, you know, it's really not whether or not, I mean, I think a lot of people have very valid critiques of the, we call the nonprofit industrial complex. And, you know, it is a reflection of the current system that we're in. So there's no, it's like, you can't like, I'm not a nonprofit apologist, but I do think that having, you know, it's just one of the tools in the toolbox. It's one of the ways that we can help actually use the system that we have to fight for the system that we want, right? You know, so I think it definitely has its limitations, but we shouldn't think of nonprofits as like the only sphere in which we are organizing for change. It's one piece of it, and I think if we, you know, are able to use that piece of it well, it does offer us some ways of getting up like rungs of the ladder or something. You know, it's like it can help. It can be a hindrance too. And for sure, you know, nonprofits supported by philanthropy has like, you know, completely reinforced a whole bunch of the kind of problems that we're actually in, not to mention, you know, how much of philanthropy in, you know, guiding nonprofits, and this is just like a very, very general term, but, you know, like how much of that has actually kind of kept a certain segment of our movements very much captured by kind of capitalism, like having to kind of rely on that system. But I also think that, like, you know, from my experience inside of movements, there are plenty of examples of movements who have also been able to kind of use what benefits they can out of nonprofits in helping provide some infrastructure for the organizing work that needs to happen. And when you can actually, yeah, like with the leadership of our communities and the creativity that they have, you know, use what's offered to actually to move things forward. And so, you know, it's kind of like it's not a either or thing. You know, are nonprofits the best? Do they suck? Well, yeah, they do suck, but or it sucks to have that have to rely on that system, but only if you think of that as the one way that we're going to bring about systemic change. Like, I don't have any I'm not stuck in the nonprofit mindset that like that's the way. I don't think that's the way we're going to succeed. It's just one part, one tool, one piece of what we can use to actually have true transformation.
Well, if I might add, I hope this isn't radical, but maybe it is. But if we could throw away all the nonprofits run by white men, right? Like, just throw them away, right? Let's uplift, and I don't know, there might be people here who donate, right? Like, or whose family donate to like Audubon or Sierra Club, you know, like a bunch of groups that are not representative of marginalized communities at the top, right? Because now I think organizations are wisening up and like making sure that they add a rainbow to their staff, and that's not going to be good enough, you know? So let's throw away a lot of nonprofits that are run by white men. Let's throw away a lot of nonprofits that don't conform, right? Because I think it's always important for me to remember that a lot of what the nonprofits do, like in the social service area, were like Black Panthers demands, you know, and that the system co-opted. So why can't we take our stuff back? And I do think that every army needs to raise money, right? Because you need to like feed soldiers, like, and I think about this in a more of a guerrilla warfare context than a military, like state military context, right? But there's just some realities. If we think we could do this with people just sacrificing themselves, I wonder how we're just kind of like perpetuating capitalism and extraction and just saying that it's for the greater good in the end, which I don't think is a transformation of society. You know, I think there's a transformation when we take care of each other and we make sure that people that we expect to fight for the greater good of all of us are taking care of themselves, you know, because going back to disruption, different people are taking different levels of risk, right? And we're seeing that now with like the arrest in Manhattan and those women from the Upper West Side who were destroying property, but then can run away to their like summer home, right? If you think about someone who's undocumented or someone who's Black who might be killed by the police when they're putting their bodies on the line, how do we make sure that we're actually taking care of what we call our comrades, right? I hear people throw that word around, but I don't see them there when people's lives are like when they're about to get evicted, when this is going to happen, you know. And so how do we make sure we're building a healthy movement and not just expecting everyone to put their bodies on the line? Like Sunrise in some ways is doing that. They're just dropping into communities and asking people to put their bodies on the line without like a sustained relationship with that community or those community members, you know. And so that's why I think having a holistic vision and really bringing people in so that there's more than just the issue, you know, like we're actually building a vision together. And that's what I think groups like CJA do really well.
I'll just, this is Hahrie. This is a good moment to jump in. I can jump in for a second on some of this. Oh,
yes,
and I think I'm just getting video back too. Okay. What I was going to say is so this is actually a question we did a little bit of research on where we were trying, my students and I did a project where we were trying to understand, oh, here's video. So back. We were trying to understand, you know, what would it look like to, okay, sorry. So the research shows that in truth, one of the big kind of phenomenon that have happened in, you know, kind of American politics across multiple domains is that there's this broken link between participation, between people and power, right? That like people could pour into the street, they can take all this action, and the system is just like unresponsive to people's needs in a lot of ways. And so one of the questions we wanted to ask is, what if we were to look at the outliers? Like, are there any commonalities across the outliers to learn how they are able to sort of build power for systems change? And I will say that like going into that project, I actually thought that like one of the commonalities that we'd find would be around organizational structure, like not in a way that reifies the nonprofit industrial complex at all, but like that there would be sort of certain kind of things about governance or something like that that would be common. And we actually found that wasn't the case at all. You know, that like the organizations and the movements that were really good at kind of building power for their people, the commonality that they had was sort of being strongly accountable and rooted in constituency, you know. And there's something really powerful about an organization that's structured around this question of like, who are my people versus what is their issue, right? And I think so often the nonprofit world, the kind of, the entire society kind of tries to force us into this, like, what is my issue? You know, these are the housing people, and these are the environment people, and these are the, you know, racial justice people and economic inequality people. But humans, you know, we are whole humans, right? And we experience all of those injustices all together, and to sort of have to divide them up into like, well, this funder is going to support that, and that funder is going to support that, I think is not representative of the way the world works. And so the organizations that we found that were most powerful, they were really grounded in a group of people, right? And then that shaped everything that they did. So it wasn't so much how they were structured that mattered, but to whom they were accountable. And then the question is, then how do you create that solidarity in your constituencies so that they're going to show up in the ways that I heard like the tail end of something Maria was describing earlier. And I'm not sure what the beginning part of what she said was, but the end part of it I totally agree with, because, you know, it's sort of about like, if we're at this barbecue together, then are you going to show up for me when I need you, you know? And so the question is, and one of the ways that we talk about it a lot is the idea of like, what does it mean to build a constituency versus to have like a client base or something like that. And the word constituency is rooted in like the Latin and Greek root of the word constituency means to stand with. Right. And so what does it mean to build a group of people who are really going to stand with each other? And then what does it mean to build an organization or a movement or whatever the structure is that is accountable to the needs of those people who have chosen to stand with each other? And so, you know, one of the things I feel like is like the actual scaffolding that we build around the people is less important than the kind of the people, the bonds within them, and then the extent to which there is a scaffolding to translate their actions into political power.
Yeah. Talk to me about accountability when I have to go to the supermarket and get harassed. No, it's all good. You know, people know where I live, unlike politicians, you know, who have multiple addresses. They can come find me if I'm doing my job incorrectly. You know, they watch me say things and they got opinions about it. So I completely agree with you.
Okay, and one thing I'll just add on that, just to kind of get back to the conversation about risk, and I'm sorry if this was like covered in a part of the meeting that I totally missed, and so if I'm being repetitive, I apologize. But so in the research that we did, like risk came out of that accountability to people, right? Because if I'm accountable to a set of humans who are going to harass me at the grocery store or whatever it is, right? Or you know, or people that I really care about as whole people, then when they have problems, I've got to figure out how to help solve them. Period, right? Like it's just like there's just no, you know, and in the same way that like as a parent, like when my child is upset, like I'm going to try to help, you know, create a venue through which my child can sort of solve problems that they have. And, you know, same with like, you know, it's just like people to whom we are committed, we sort of work to solve those problems. And so all the risk taking, whether it's sort of the social risk of asking other people to commit with you or political risk or whatever the risks are that are necessary in social movements, are rooted in that kind of accountability to people. So I see those as being very intertwined.
Yeah, and that is at the basis of what organizing is. Organizing is like is creating like multiple layers of constituencies that they recognize how they are intertwined, and just like building connections with people like that, and you build more and more, and that network, that weaving together of those connections is what keeps people safe. It's what like keeps people also able to imagine like something completely different together. It's like, I think being able to be in community with other people is what gives you the courage to imagine something totally different and to fight for that with each other. And that's like the heart of what organizing should be about, you know, and that it really, that's why like so much of the kind of environmental data just doesn't meet anyone where their heart is. It's like, what, I'm fighting for a number, I'm fighting for, you know, a part per million or something. I don't get it. But, you know, when you're talking about, you know, my neighbors and their kids and my future grandchildren, and like how we've been connected over history in our place where we live, and that we want to fight for each other, you know, and that you're building that when you can recognize that, you know, you recognize your connection and you recognize your own struggle in other people's struggle, and you want to fight for each other. Like that's what's at the heart of it. And so like nonprofits can help, going back to the whole nonprofit thing. I think there's ways that nonprofits can actually support that, and nonprofits can like completely go against that. So it's like it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just like it's a tool, and if it's used well, then it can actually help support that. And if it's not, then, you know, just like Maria was saying, there's like a whole history of how people use that sort of IRS tax status to do all kinds of stuff that actually makes us turn against each other, you know. And that's, you know, the same with any of these other structures. Like they're only as powerful and useful and good as we make them.
I think just on, so I completely agree with what Miya just said. And just on that point, there's this book that I think about a lot that was written by a sociologist named Liz Clemens called The People's Lobby, where she's looking at a lot of the movements at the turn of the progressive era, which were, you know, problematic in ways that we already talked about at the beginning. But but the question that she asked is a really interesting one, which is, you know, how did people who had no power in the political system change the very rules of the game by which politics was played? You know, because in the progressive era, like a lot of the reforms are like direct election of senators, direct voting in the Australian ballot, sort of all these things that kind of changed the rules of the game itself, as opposed to just like fighting for a policy outcome or something like that. And one of the things that she talks about is what Miya says, is that, you know, the term that she uses, that what you see within these movements, the women's movement, labor, farmers, you know, is this proliferation of these different kind of organizational repertoires, where it's like, on the one hand, there are parts of the movement that worked within whatever the equivalent of the nonprofit industrial complex was, but they used that as a tool to make themselves legible to a broader power structure, even as they would then challenge the very kind of norms and assumptions that underlied that structure from, you know, from within. And you had groups that were sort of sitting outside of the structure altogether. And it was a combination of those things all together that made it possible for the movement to change like fundamental rules about how the game was played. And so it's a really interesting account of sort of this tension between kind of legibility and challenge, like legibility and struggle as being contained within one movement in working with power.
Well, we're going into our last 10 minutes, so I want to leave enough room to talk about the things or surface things that we haven't had a chance to surface yet. You know, there are other questions here about like also building the new. I think, Miya, you started talking about people imagining what could be, you know, what are the alternatives, you know, in the struggles that people put forth and the resistance to the existing systems. People are also building new ideas about what could be. So, and if there were any thoughts that you all had about what it takes to not only deconstruct and challenge the existing systems, but like what it's going to take to actually, you know, fight forward. You know, what are some of the things that you all are thinking about in this moment right now, politically, economically, with all the things that are happening with Black Lives Matter? You know, what are the opportunities, I guess, for like building the new that you're looking ahead towards? And then, or you could just ignore that and say, ask each other questions that you've been dying to ask each other, or raise things that maybe we haven't had a chance to raise yet here.
Yeah, I don't know. We got to figure out how to have conversations, right? On Zoom. Still, this has been disruptive to the way we're still paper and pen over here. So. It's been an adjustment. So I want to pretend I know how to answer your question, but I don't. Things on my mind are this obsession with the federal election, you know, just like where it's like we're really putting the cart before the horse, because it's almost this like, people are obsessed with who the president is and forget about you don't want to talk about accountability and like, you know, because I just feel like funders have been asking this a lot. What's going on with the federal stuff? First off, not a C4, so whatever. But whoever is in president matters, you know, so that's a risk. I realize there's a lot of risk just being on panels and talking that are taken. But anyway, I do think that we need to learn how to like focus though on who is our council person, because that's accessible to people, that they can show up to the council person's door and then make them feel accountable to their constituents. And then we could scale that up to our mayors. We could scale that up to our congressional representatives and our senators, you know, like I would love to make Cory Booker feel more of the heat for his support on nuclear. You know, like there are things that we need to do, I think as, you know, frontline communities that will matter, right? And then whoever, no matter who the president is, we would have more power. And I want to I want to reframe and shift that, because it's always like, what happens, Biden with Trump, and this weird binary, that's not how our communities exist, you know? And so how do we really start getting with the program that transformation is only going to happen from the ground up? And then we do need alliances like the Climate Justice Alliance, so that folks like like us at ICC can be connected with folks with like Miya at APEN, you know, and like be connected with California and the fires, and we can feel that empathy. That empathy leads to solidarity. You know, I feel like we're always pushing solidarity, but to get to solidarity, I need to have empathy for people, you know, and to have empathy, I kind of need to know their stories so that I'm not always just focused on mine. I realize like the multitude of human experiences. And why then we take to the streets, you know, when we have those eruptions, because my heart's involved. And I, you know, some of these conversations are too academic and they strip away the heart. So how do we put the heart back in and then make sure that we're using language, like the way we talk is just regular, you know, like fuck the academy. Let's talk like how we would talk to our friends, you know?
Yeah, there was a lot in there. I don't know where to go with that. But I just like, I think, because I agree with everything you're saying, Maria. I think also just like that question about like building the new, I mean, what you're talking about in terms of democracy and people being able to viscerally experience like the accountability inside of democracies really starts at a local level. And I just think part of building the new is building new democracy too. So like that's all part of what we're trying to build into a resilient system, you know, is actual real democracy that, and I think that just connects to the other things like the communities, both like the democracy, the power that people have to make decisions over the things that most impact their lives, that's connected to like when people experience that, they're much more willing to fight for the things that are wrong, you know, just to use simple language, like that they're much more willing to go out also and fight for the things that they need, like, and that part of building the new, why it's so important is because people have to experience it in a real way, in the same way that they need to experience real democracy, need to actually experience in their neighborhoods what the future of their community can look like. That's like part of what, and they need to actually experience the power of contributing to that, of being a part of that, and that like they're, you know, whether you're talking about like the new energy infrastructure or zero waste or transportation or the schools that we want and need or the food systems that we want, like being able to actually build examples of that at a local level that you're a part of is part of what builds this web of interconnection and like builds permanently organized communities. Like that's part of, we have to be part of building the power as we are reconstructing the society that we want.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I would just add, I think this is kind of like restating what was already said, but you know, to me, the key question is like, you know, this idea of building the new, imagination has to be rooted in people's experience, you know, like, you know, there's nothing more powerful than that. And so the question in a way is like, you know, we have to profoundly restructure our entire system, because right now our system is not set up to be rooted in people's experience and to give power to that, you know? So it's this question of like, how do regular people, you know, in their everyday lives have the opportunity to do public life and to do it in a way that's grounded in their own experience, that's connected to one another, and that gives them ownership over the process of change. You know, and as people have that experience, then the next question in my mind is, how do we like build these fractals that link that from the sort of my own little community all the way up to, you know, whatever the kind of systems of power are that I want to change. And so I think that like, right, so like sort of like if we think about the big challenges, one, it's like, what does it look like to construct that experience right? Of doing politics in your own community, however you define that community geographically or not, right? But then second, what are the structures that we need to connect the fractals so that what I experience in my immediate community is mirrored in the sort of layers that grow from that. And I think that both of those are challenges that we have right now, but that it's that kind of restructuring that we need to make possible the kind of imaginary that we want.
Do y'all have any other questions or things you want to throw out in the last few minutes to each other that you wanted to ask one another?
I mean, I feel like I want to go and listen to the 15 minutes that I missed. I'm sure there are questions. I'm sure I would have questions, but
well, it's funny because I think, Hahrie, I said something very similar to what you ended up saying. So it was nice that we were like aligned even while you weren't there. Great.
I'm relieved to hear that. So
we channeled you, Hahrie. We channeled you right into the Zoom. So, and we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more in depth in our breakout group, so we can chat a little bit more. I'm going to bring Sujatha here back, and she's going to tell us a little bit about how we're going to. Yeah, go ahead.
Like, because I'm thinking people are going to go into breakout groups,
yes.
And like I don't want to call it an offering, but the only thing I would say is like to be your whole self, right? Because one thing I've noticed is just like, you know, like the thing I said about you're talking to your friends, because I feel like I don't want to say that they're masked, but they're like different positions that people take up if they're like in a room with politicians, or if they're in the room with their funder or with their community member. And like there's an organization in Newark called People's Organization for Progress, and they fight for victims of police brutality, and they always wear their t-shirt. They're like yellow beaten down t-shirt that, you know, they have one of, but they'll wear it to the meetings. And I remember very early on feeling like, why do you do that? And they were like, well, because the governor is supposed to be here for us, right? Like, why do we have to dress up for him? Like, he should dress up for us. And I realized just how much I want to stress that as people go into small groups is like, just talk like yourself, you know, like we front too much for each other of like trying to prove something to nobody really, because no one's watching. And I think we could, if we're just more human, we'll get further. And if we could push each other, you know, like, to have a good conversation so you're not bored, because if you're bored, it's also partly your fault. Anyway, you know, so like that would be my offering, I guess, as people go into small groups, is like to really try to push themselves and the others to be more vulnerable so that we can have real conversation, because we goddamn need it right now, you know?
Love it. That's a good charge for the group, Sujatha, to take us into our 5-minute break and breakout rooms.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria, for that baton passing. In part, and I say that in part because we designed the breakout rooms very much so that people could have these really authentic conversations with each other. So instead of just listening to other folks talk, this is an opportunity in the breakout rooms for people to, with each other in community, building relationships, really get to sort of like, what is the meat and the core of what you heard? And I think there were some really great things that people shared. The speaker shared about really relationships and accountability and risk, but also this question about experience and legibility, right? Like, so how do we kind of translate between different spheres? So the small group discussions these are the two questions. The first one is what are some interesting things that you heard in this conversations? But secondly, what is necessary for the EJ movement to be ready to fight forward and to build the new? And what we're asking folks to do is, we know that some people oftentimes, don't have the full time and are not interested in being in discussion groups. So if that is the case, please step off now. And the folks who are interested in the discussion groups, please stay on the line. And that will allow us to organize and put people into breakout rooms. We're going to take a 5-minute break. And so we'll come back at 2:05 and people will go into breakout rooms, and then we'll give, when we come back, I'll give a few more instructions about the breakout rooms, and then you'll go into breakout groups. So if you're interested in the breakout groups, please stay online, just mute yourself and stop your video, which you've been doing already, and we will come back at 2:05. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Miya and Maria and Hahrie, and we'll be coming back.
Welcome back, everyone. We're just waiting for folks to trickle back into the main room here so we can kick off our Q&A session and hear a little bit about what you all talked about and the burning questions you have to throw back out to our guests. Let's see. We'll just wait a few more minutes for folks to come back in from their breakout rooms.
Anna, is there any question that you want to pose to our speakers based on the conversation we were having in the small breakout?
Yeah, we had a really great conversation in the breakout about the kind of fellowship program that might be most relevant in this moment for EJ movement leaders. I had some great feedback from folks about making space. So I don't know if any of you all, Miya, Maria, Hahrie, if you wanted to share any of the insights that we talked about in the breakout, or if you wanted to add anything to the conversation we had earlier. But yeah, we did go very in depth on some of the ideas for whether we bring in, several folks from the same organization. Do you work with like emerging leaders, or do you have more of a think tank where we really develop shared space for the movement building? So, or we can just jump into the Q&A too, because I'm sure folks have a lot of insights. Let me just, yeah, Maria, Hahrie.
Sorry, Zoom is so hard.
It's awkward. It's a little awkward, but.
I mean, one thing that stood out to me about our conversation was just the idea of really trying to invest in organizations, not just individuals, and that like really if we're trying to build power in our movements, that we really need to think of the opportunity for the organizations to be substantially, to build the organization capacity with this. And also like talking through ways, because we've all had various experiences with fellowships in our own organizations, and like some that have been great and additive, and some that have been like a real kind of mess and have actually just taken time from the organization, time and resources. And so, trying to address the tension right now, especially where there's so much going on, and how do we like build more capacity into organizations as part of the process, and rather than, there's always going to be tension, because doing any form of leadership development, capacity building stuff or whatever, it takes capacity just to absorb that. So organizations, there's kind of no way around that, but how do you do that in the way that's sort of most generative for the organizations that are participating? Well, that's my takeaway.
Great. Well, maybe I can follow up to that comment, Miya, with a question that came out of the small groups, and it really builds on the previous conversation, the previous section, really about this question of relationships. And part of this emphasis and focus and investment on relationship building, both as a sort of core and fundamental part of the process, but also sort of it disrupts the kind of white dominant Western sort of colonial notion of individualism. And I'm going to add a slight question to this also, which is like both, what have been experiences that you all have had, and Hahrie, I know you have written about this, around kind of emotional resonance and connectivity and kind of the transformational potential of that, but also maybe you can also share some times where you've tried something and it has failed. It hasn't worked. I mean, partly because it is going up against dominant culture. And so like, where have you been successful, and what have you learned from that centering of both emotional resonance and connectivity, and relationships? And maybe Maria, you can start.
Okay. let me see, like when I was trying to follow the question, you know, I just keep pushing, like, we gotta simplify. I'm like, so when we failed and like what that did for connections.
Well, like when you've succeeded, like when you've centered, like, and how do you build
I mean,
emotional?
we mostly fail. We mostly fail. Like, I just want to be clear about that. Like, I will work my ass off and feel like, ooh, this is all my blood, sweat, and tears. There's no way. This, I see my colleagues, you know, like all my community, we're all out there. We're at the art builds. We're at the hearing. We have, the room is packed. They had to open up upstairs. We're yelling. The police comes in. You know, like, I'm like, there's no way. Yeah, there's a way. You know, they're just gonna be like, nope, you know, you're denied. This goes forward. Thank you. And then somehow we have to pick up the pieces with like our community, you know, because you feel like crying or exploding. There's that explosion, like what? But then when you're together in those moments, like, and you realize, oh, I'm not here by myself. We'll come back. You know, we're gonna get you. Revenge. We're gonna get it. You know, like, and then there's something that in that community, because community I think is really disruptive. They've like broken us, like someone said, I was trying to read, you know, you get into like neo-colonialism, I'm like, you're kind of losing me, but that's just me. Some people love that, right? Like there's something for everybody. But thinking about how colonialism has though been focused on the individual and stripped away our interdependence on each other, I think that being connected and making sure that our struggles are intertwined, that's true disruption of the system, because they bank on the fact that as individuals we'll give up. And there's something Nancy Zach, who's an organizer for like 40 plus years at ICC, which is why it's about organizations, not people, right? Because I'm new, but the organizational history I learned from, she always says we can't give up at the same time. So then we could be in the room and see the same thing. And maybe I give up because that was my baby, this project, this campaign. But the other person who just came in to support me, they don't give up. And then I get to take a break and support them on their campaign next time while I heal, you know, and lick my wounds so that I can come back for the next fight, you know, but we can't all give up at the same time.
Okay. Miya or Hahrie, want to add to anything?
I
guess,
mean,
so,
oh, go ahead, Hahrie.
okay. The only thing I was going to say is that I feel like when we talk, what am I trying to say here? I think that to me it's the juxtaposition of the emotional experience and power and having those conversations together that's really important. And sometimes I worry when people talk only about empathy, for example, because I think empathy can often be stripped of this notion of shared struggle or power, really. And it's like you need both, right? You need the emotional connection for all the reasons that we talked about, but it has to be in the context of the ways in which there are power disparities in the relationships we construct with each other. There are power disparities in the way that those relationships are projected out into the world, and sort of the acknowledgement of that broader context within which it happens. And so I feel like when I think about the experiences that we've seen where, centering that emotional connection is most successful is when those two conversations about the power structure and the emotional capacity are kept, braided together throughout the entire conversation and throughout the entire interactions.
So I'll just quickly jump in on, I mean, there are multiple questions there, and I'll say with what Maria said, like, yeah, we're failing all the time, but we're not. I don't really think of it as failing. We're just not always winning every single day. We're not always winning the main thing that we're setting out to win, but we're definitely always struggling. But I think one of the things that lessons for me as an organizer, a couple of things is, like, one of the reasons that it's so essential to have this deep connectedness to community is that, like, I think it's really easy to either overestimate or underestimate where people are at and what people believe and what people are willing to kind of go out in the streets and fight for, or go to, sometimes I think, and I've seen that in our organization in both ways. Like, sometimes our organizers can be the ones who are kind of standing in the way of our leaders and members. Sometimes our leaders and members are actually ready to do a lot more than we think. Like we're as an organizer, sometimes we feel very protective of the communities that we're in, and that it's easy to sometimes forget and speak for people and think that you're actually the ones who are defining what risks people are willing to take. And so I think getting out of the way sometimes is really important to remember, and that can be you know, a way to, like, a fast track to failure is kind of trying to like really not being out of alignment with the way the community is. And then the other part of that, the other side of that is, like, if you don't really understand how much the community is is driven by the same dominant world culture that the rest of us are, you know, and that, like, inside of our own communities, that there's very reactionary, very, you know, like can be you know, in all the ways that we think we're trying to change, that lives in our communities too. And we can't underestimate that. And I think that is often a way that we kind of can, as organizations, can get ahead of ourselves and kind of get in our own way.
Great, thank you. Another question that came up, this is from group 4, and we talked a little bit about this, which is, you know, so there's most nonprofits have an imperative towards survival, right? That they want to continue to operate, and that sometimes this imperative towards survival can actually conflict with systems change work. So really challenging the system, doing things differently. And how do you kind of juggle that tension? Or, like, what have you learned in trying to hold that tension between organizational survival and kind of real challenging change? And Miya, you look like you have a thought there, so.
Yeah, sorry, it's just agreeing too much, right? Yeah, because it's just another way we get in our own way sometimes. And like you know, the old, like, one of the first things that I learned from mentors that I've had in this work, and when trying to build an organization, that, you know, you can never make decisions based on what a funder wants you to do. And that goes for you can never make decisions about, you know, what a politician wants you to do, or what, like, you know, but like that's, you have to be rooted in a really strong and clear vision for your community, and let that drive what you're building for. And sometimes that means giving up things that would serve to build the capacity of the organization, or would get you incrementally farther than you think, you know, you could. But in many other ways, it's like it adds so much power because you're totally liberated from that, you know, being tied to that. But there's so many ways that both, like, and I don't want to stick just on philanthropy, but like philanthropy is a helpful example because I think we all is more easily understood, just the direct connection between money and, like, what nonprofits do, and how much philanthropy tries to shape what organization, especially like the sliver of money that actually goes to organizing, which, you know, in terms of philanthropy, we're just talking about a teeny tiny little sliver there. But, you know, it's so hard sometimes, because when we're building organizations inside the nonprofit structure, you know, these are people's jobs. They're people, you know, people are relying on you to actually feed their families. And, you know, these are often, you know, our organizers, people from the community, and, like, we're trying to build a home for people, a political home. You want to protect that, you know, you want to actually meet people's needs in that way. But so there's often these, like, choices that you have to make, I think, and that goes into, like, this whole question of risk and all of that, and, like, what's the payoff for actually, like, how can you actually continue to build that connectedness around a transformative agenda if it's being driven by, you know, somebody else's interests?
And I think to the point that you said about organizing being a sliver, I think that this question of the nonprofit and industrial complex, I hear it a lot, particularly, like from folks. It's like jazzy language, but I'm also like, who are you talking about? Are you actually talking about grassroots organizations as the nonprofit industrial who are barely getting funded? Or are you talking about these mega, like big national organizations that have co-opted movements that have tons of paid staff and move very little work? Like, I think let's just be very sophisticated in our analysis of who we're talking about. Because I feel like whenever some people are upset, they're just like, nonprofit industrial complex, and they want to walk away. And like, that's not the reality. Most people ain't like, philanthropy doesn't want to fund organizing. They don't want you to have like, they think it's too risky, And so like, let's just be careful when we're pointing guns and using fancy terminology of like who it does and does not apply to. And if it does apply to an organization, I would question spending energy there trying to reform a broken thing, like, because there are organizations, shout out to us here, that need donations and that need support and that need folks to show up, and so there's always probably something better. Because we're not going to deconstruct this industrial complex, but there are things within it that have been helpful to our communities, that are anchors. And like, how do we invest in anchor institutions and people who have accountability directly to the community, And I think those are key things to look out for is, do they have public community meetings? Do they have community boards? Like, how do they actually govern? And where are the points that you can intervene if like you don't like what they're doing, like there should be a way to be addressed. But let's just be careful, right? Because it's not in apples to apples all the time. There's nonprofits that do all sorts of things. There's right-wing nonprofits, like nonprofit is a big structure and a big blanket. So let's just be a little more sophisticated, I think, because sometimes we're taking down movements that are already struggling.
I think I'll just sort of add,
Go ahead, Hahrie.
it's just one really quick thing. I'll just sort of add, because just that, so agree with everything that was just said. And that I think that like there's a couple like powerful shifts that happen when organizations or movements kind of shift thinking, and like a lot of things that we've talked about, like like I sort of think about the shift from like what is my issue to who are my people, from thinking about policy to power, sort of like all these different kind of things. And to me, there's also like a powerful shift that comes from thinking about constraints versus opportunities. So it's like, I am constrained by my funder, I'm constrained by these imperatives to do X, Y, or Z, versus what is the opportunity that I have to advance my own agenda. And these are all kind of like subtle ways of reframing the conversation. But then, I feel like a lot of the organizations that I've seen that are able to kind of do this kind of work that Maria and Miya are describing so powerfully, have like slightly different frames that they use, that they bring into all of these difficult dilemmas that every organizer and organization faces.
Right, thank you. Well, perhaps we only have a minute left, so I'm not going to ask another question. I'm mostly going to just take the time to thank the three of you very much for this really rich conversation. I feel like we got a chance to talk about a whole range of things and explore, and it's been very helpful for us in terms of us thinking about the design of this fellowship. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Anna to close us out.
Yes, thank you, Sujatha. Yeah, thank you to our guests today, Dr. Hahrie Han, Miya Yoshitani, Maria Lopez-Nuñez. We're very, very grateful for carving out a little bit of creative space and time to generously share with us in this conversation and to help us think about the future together. And if you're interested in more of these conversations, we have one more coming up on September 25th about how the revolution will or will not be funded. So if you're interested in that, please stay tuned and sign up for that session. And we'll be emailing you all more information about the fellowship as well. So if you're interested in learning about how the fellowship evolves over time, you can check out our website and the emails that come out. So thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.